If you look at Great Britain on a map today, it seems small, an island nation, nestled in the North Atlantic, defined by its quiet dignity and its reign. But this image is a ghost, a whisper of what once was. Because a little over a century ago, this small island didn't just rule the waves, it ruled the world. 1/4 of the planet's land, and nearly 1/3 of its people, all under a single flag, the British Empire. The empire on which the sun, famously, never set. We often ask, how did a nation so small achieve a scale so vast? But that's the wrong question. The real question, the one that reveals a darker, more profound truth, is at what cost? This isn't just a story of conquest. It's the story of a paradox, a tragedy woven into the very fabric of power. It's the story of an empire built on an illusion, the illusion of control, and how that obsession with control became the very thing that tore it apart, piece by bloody piece. This is the entire history of the British Empire. Our story begins not with a grand vision, but with insecurity. In the late 16th century, England was an underdog, a Protestant island staring down the Catholic might of Spain. Queen Elizabeth I, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, knew she couldn't compete head-on. So she unleashed her sea dogs, men like Sir Francis Drake, part explorer, part state-sanctioned pirate, to bleed the Spanish Empire of its New World gold. These were not acts of empire building. They were acts of defiance, but they planted a seed. The idea that wealth and power lay beyond the horizon. The first real attempt at a colony, Roanoke in 1585, was a chilling failure. The settlers vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a single cryptic word carved into a post, Croatoan. It was a humbling lesson the world was not so easily tamed, not so easily controlled, but the English were persistent. As historian James Belloc notes, their model wasn't just about ruling over people, it was about replacing them. It was about settlement. And the first true testing ground for this brutal form of control was right next door, in Ireland. The Plantation of Ulster in the early 1600s was a blueprint for everything that would follow. Protestant settlers from England and Scotland were systematically moved onto lands seized from Irish Catholics. The goal was total demographic control, to create a loyal Protestant buffer that would secure England's vulnerable western flank. But what it actually created was a wound, a deep, generational wound of sectarian hatred and violent resistance that would fester for 400 years. This was the first bloody lesson of the paradox: the harder you squeeze to enforce control, the more you create the very resistance you seek to crush. This model, this tragedy, was then exported across the Atlantic. After England and Scotland united to form Great Britain in 1707, a union born partly from Scotland's own disastrous colonial failure in Panama, the focus turned westward with renewed vigor. 13 colonies took root along the American seaboard. They were structured in different ways. Crown colonies, charter colonies, but all were designed with a single purpose: to serve the mother country, to provide raw materials like timber, tobacco, and sugar, and to be a captive market for British goods, to be controlled. For a time, it worked spectacularly. The colonies grew, fueled by land, ambition, and the horrific engine of the transatlantic slave trade, a brutal, dehumanizing system that transported millions of Africans into bondage, enriching the empire beyond imagination. But with every ship that crossed the Atlantic, with every new town built in the forests of North America, the threads of control were stretching thinner and thinner. The colonists, thousands of miles from London, were developing their own identity. They were reading English philosophers like John Locke about liberty and the rights of man, and they began to apply those radical ideas to themselves. The paradox was stirring. The empire was building its own antithesis. The mid-18th century was Britain's moment of absolute triumph. The 7 Years' War, what some call the first true world war, ended in a stunning British victory. At the 1763 Treaty of Paris, a humiliated France handed over Canada and all its territory east of the Mississippi. Spain ceded Florida. From North America to the Caribbean, to the burgeoning trading posts in India, the British Empire was a global colossus. It seemed invincible, but victory is a powerful poison. As the saying goes, empires often die from indigestion. Britain now had a massive, sprawling global territory to defend, and a mountain of debt from the war that had won it, to the Parliament in London, populated by men who had never set foot in America. The solution was simple, logical, and fair. The colonies, who had benefited most from the protection of the British military, should help pay for it. It was an accountant's solution, a matter of balancing the books. It was an act of control. This led to a series of taxes. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767. To the British government, this was routine administration, but to the American colonists, it was a profound betrayal. They had no representatives in Parliament. They had no voice in the laws that governed them. This wasn't administration, it was tyranny. The cry of "no taxation without representation" wasn't just a clever slogan. It was the howl of a people realizing the chains of control had become suffocating.
Though, ultimately
the paradox of control became explosive.
Oglethorpe designed
Every single
Georgia
attempt
to
by
have South
Britain to assert
Carolinian
its
migrants
authority
enjoyed a
only fueled the
significant
flames
wealth
of rebellion.
advantage over the original.
They passed the intolerable acts to punish Boston for the Tea Party, which only united the colonies in opposition. They sent more troops to enforce order, which only led to bloodshed at Lexington and Concord. The British saw the colonists as ungrateful children who needed to be disciplined. They failed to see that these were no longer just English outposts. They had become something new, something American. The American Revolution was, for Britain, an unthinkable, world-shattering disaster. They were fighting their own people, on unfamiliar terrain, an ocean away from their supply lines. When General Cornwallis surrendered his army at Yorktown in 1781, it wasn't just a military defeat. It was the complete and utter failure of their philosophy of control. The loss of America was the empire's first great self-inflicted wound. It was absolute proof of the paradox the attempt to enforce total control had resulted in the total loss of it. A lesser nation might have crumbled, its imperial ambitions shattered forever. But Britain didn't shrink. It pivoted. Beaten in the west, it turned its gaze to the east, with a new, harder, more ruthless determination. The lesson it learned wasn't to loosen its grip. It was to squeeze even harder. And the price of that lesson would be paid in the blood of millions. The 19th century. Britain's imperial century. If America was a lesson in failure, India was to be the masterclass in absolute control. But this control was not wielded by the government. Not at first. It was wielded by a monstrous quasi-corporate entity, the British East India Company. A private company with its own army, its own navy, its own laws, and an insatiable sociopathic hunger for profit. Through a century of cunning diplomacy, bribery, and overwhelming brute force, the company devoured the subcontinent piece by piece. It exploited the complex rivalries between local princes and maharajas, pitting them against each other, always ensuring the company came out on top. India, with its vast riches, spices, and population, became the jewel in the crown, the financial engine that would power the global empire. But this was a control built on a foundation of pure terror. The British were a tiny minority, ruling over hundreds of millions through a mixture of fear and the might of their local Indian soldiers. The sepoys. These men were the very instrument of British control. And in 1857, that instrument snapped with terrifying force. The spark was a rumor, a seemingly small thing, that the new rifle cartridges, which had to be bitten open with the teeth, were greased with pig and cow fat, an abomination to both Muslim and Hindu soldiers. It was just a spark. But the powder keg had been filling for a century. A keg packed with resentment over lost lands, shattered traditions, religious proselytizing, and the casual daily humiliation of British racism. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was not a mutiny. It was a firestorm. It was the primal scream of a people pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The violence that erupted was horrifying, on a scale rarely seen. A torrent of blood and vengeance washed across northern India. For the British, it was the ultimate betrayal by those they had armed. For the Indians, it was a desperate, doomed war for freedom. When the rebellion was finally, brutally crushed, the British response was medieval in its savagery. Entire villages were razed. Mutineers were tied to the mouths of cannons and literally blown to pieces. The East India Company was dissolved, and the British Crown took direct control. They believed the problem was the method of control, not the concept of control itself. So they doubled down. They built thousands of miles of railways, telegraphs, and a vast, suffocating bureaucracy, all designed to bind India to them irrevocably. But they had created something else, a chasm of mistrust so deep it would never be bridged. The jewel in the crown was now a prison, and the British were its wardens. This obsession played out across the globe. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century saw Britain carve up a continent with a pen and a ruler in a Berlin office, ignoring millennia of tribal and ethnic history, creating artificial borders that are still bleeding to this day. They fought bitter wars against the Boers in South Africa, engaged in the great game of espionage against Russia in Central Asia, all to protect the routes to India, to secure the jewel, to maintain control. And then came the 20th century, and with it, 2 world wars. In its moments of greatest peril, Britain called upon its empire, and the empire answered. Over 2.5 million men from India alone served in the First World War. Millions more from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, and the Caribbean. They fought and they died in the freezing mud of Flanders and the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia for a king they had never seen, and an empire that often treated them as less than human. They helped Britain achieve victory, but that victory was the final, fatal blow. The cost of the wars left Britain bankrupt. Its moral authority was shredded. How could it claim to fight a war for the freedom of Europe while denying that same freedom to hundreds of millions in its own empire? The paradox had finally come home to roost. The soldiers returning home were not the same subservient subjects who had left. They had seen the world. They had seen the empire's vulnerability, and they wanted their reward. They wanted freedom. The end came not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out sigh, a wind of change. As Prime Minister Harold Macmillan aptly called it, Britain, exhausted and broke, no longer had the will or the means to hold on. It began in earnest with India and Pakistan in 1947, a moment of freedom that was immediately drowned in the horror of partition, a cataclysmic wave of sectarian violence that killed over 1 million people, another tragic, bloody echo of the divide and rule strategy Britain had perfected. Then, one by one, the dominoes fell. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. The vast red swaths on the world map began to shrink, year by year, like a fading bloodstain. The empire tried to transform itself into a family, so the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations. A noble idea, perhaps, but it was an afterlife, a ghost of the power that once was. The final symbolic act came at the stroke of midnight on June 30th, 1997. In a rain-soaked ceremony in Hong Kong, the Union Jack was lowered for the last time. The last major colonial territory was handed back to China. Prince Charles famously described it as the end of empire. The sun, at long last, had set. So what is left? The legacy is all around us. It is inescapable. It's in the English language, the lingua franca of business, science, and the internet. It's in the systems of law and government that shape nations across the globe. It's in the global obsession with soccer and cricket. But the legacy is also in the scars, the deep, unhealed wounds, the arbitrary borders that continue to fuel conflict and instability in Africa and the Middle East, the economic dependencies that are so hard to break, the complex, often painful, psychological relationship between Britain and its former subjects. And perhaps the most profound legacy is within Britain itself. The empire is gone, but the empire came home. The people from nearly every nation Britain once ruled now live on the very island that started it all, creating a vibrant, multicultural, and often contentious modern society. A living, breathing microcosm of the world it once governed. The story of the British Empire is a monumental cautionary tale of human ambition, power, and its ultimate futility. It teaches us that the desire for absolute control is a self-devouring fire. The more you build the walls of your fortress, the more you imprison yourself within it. The British Empire is not, in the end, a story of a small island that conquered the world. It is the story of an empire that, in its relentless 400-year pursuit of control, conquered itself. And we, all of us, still live in the world its ghost left behind.